There is a layer beneath the infrastructure story that the AI industry keeps pretending is optional. It isn't the chips. It isn't the benchmark chart. It isn't even the model. It's the human layer, the labor being reorganized around autonomous systems, the legal shields being built around generative outputs, the public emotions that decide whether adoption compounds or stalls, and the policy boundaries that get drawn before anyone agrees on a federal framework. That layer is where the real shape of the next 2 years gets decided. And today, it moved. I'm Nova.
And I'm Alloy, and this is OpenClaw Daily. Today we have 6 stories, but they all connect to one question: when AI stops being a lab demo and starts becoming operating policy, who absorbs the change? Engineers do. Courts do. Legislatures do. Young workers do. Infrastructure buyers do. And companies trying to force productivity gains out of half-finished deployments definitely do. Nova, let's start with Meta, because that story is the clearest version of the future arriving without asking permission.
Reuters reported that Meta is involuntarily transferring top software engineers into a new applied AI engineering organization. And the detail that matters most is the one that strips away any ambiguity. The memo from Vice President Maya Saba says, quote, "The transfers aren't optional. That is not a suggestion to reskill. That is not a voluntary internal mobility program. That is management saying the company's highest priority work now sits inside AI engineering, and if you're one of the strongest people available, you're going there whether you plan to or not."
And the destination matters. This is not just another internal tooling team building copilots for developers. The stated goal is much more aggressive. Meta wants autonomous AI agents building, testing, and shipping products, with human engineers supervising the process rather than doing the work directly. That is a very different model of software development from the one most engineers think they signed up for.
That's the part one don't want to sanitize. There is a tendency in tech reporting to phrase this as modernization or strategic focus. But if you're an engineer inside Meta, the lived meaning may be much simpler. The company is restructuring top technical labor around a future where the machine does more of the execution and the human becomes an overseer, exception handler, and systems monitor.
And this is happening in the context of layoffs. That's important because it changes how the message lands. Meta has been cutting roles while spending heavily on AI infrastructure. So when management says, "We are moving our strongest talent into applied AI engineering," that is not heard in a neutral environment. It is heard in an environment where people know the company is reallocating budget, reallocating prestige, and very likely redefining which kinds of engineering work remain central.
The strategic logic is obvious enough. Gartner projects that by 2027, 80% of the engineering workforce will need to upskill, and by the end of 2026, 40% of enterprise applications will embed task-specific AI agents. If you believe those forecasts, or even half believe them, then waiting is expensive. Meta doesn't want to be the company that taught its engineers to use AI after competitors taught their engineers to manage fleets of agents. So they are pulling the transition forward.
But there is a labor story here that I think is more important than the strategy story. We are used to hearing executives talk about AI as augmentation, a friendly second set of hands, a productivity multiplier, a tool that gives workers superpowers. Mandatory transfer into an org whose explicit goal is autonomous product building agents reveals the harder version of the truth. In large companies, augmentation is often just the transitional branding for workforce redesign.
Exactly. And once you frame it that way, the memo reads differently. "We're moving our strongest talent" sounds flattering. "The transfers aren't optional" sounds like a command. Put those together and you get the actual message. The company is selecting the people it most trusts to build the system that could eventually reduce how many people are needed for the same output.
That's not necessarily irrational from the firm's perspective. If you're Meta, you want your best people shaping the agentic layer because that layer becomes core infrastructure. But from the employee perspective, the incentives are more complicated. You are being told to help automate the work category you belong to, under a mandate, during a period of layoffs.
And I think this is why the story matters beyond Meta. This is the clearest public example so far of what AI-first engineering looks like when it stops being a slide deck and turns into operating reality. It means org charts move. It means reassignment can be compulsory. It means the prestige hierarchy shifts toward agent builders and away from traditional software roles. And it means the human layer of the company, not just the technical stack, gets redesigned around the premise that autonomy is the destination.
I want to stay with that for a second, because there's a temptation to treat mandatory transfer as a culture story when it's really a control story. Companies reveal what they believe about the future by what they make optional and what they don't. Learning a new internal dashboard is optional. Volunteering for a speculative skunkworks team is optional. Being moved into the AI org with your strongest engineers on direct instruction is the company saying this is no longer adjacent to the business. This is the business.
And that's why the language matters so much. A lot of the AI transition has been narrated in reassuring terms: copilots, assistants, leverage, augmentation. Mandatory transfer punctures that vocabulary. It tells employees that the firm isn't just buying a tool. It's reassigning authority, budget, and strategic identity around a machine-mediated workflow.
Which also means the rest of the industry is watching for the management mechanics, not just the technical outcomes. If Meta can compel the move, stand up the org, and show faster shipping or lower cost, then boards elsewhere will ask why their own companies are still treating agentic engineering as an elective experiment. That's how one internal memo becomes a template.
And if the rollout goes badly, that's informative too. Because it would suggest there are real limits to how fast you can reorganize elite technical labor around autonomy without breaking morale, trust, or execution quality. Either outcome teaches the market something important.
The question every other big tech company is now quietly asking is not whether Meta is too aggressive. It's whether Meta is early.
And if Meta is early but right, then a lot of engineers across the industry are going to discover that the future of software work is not writing more code. It's supervising the systems that do.
Story 2 is less dramatic on the surface, but structurally it may matter even more. A Supreme Court ruling overturning a $1 billion copyright judgment against Cox Communications is now being read as a major legal shield for AI developers.
The underlying principle is contributory liability. The court clarified that a company is not automatically liable for infringement committed by its users unless it intentionally encouraged that infringement. That's long-standing copyright logic in one sense, but this ruling sharpens the standard in a way that matters far beyond internet service providers.
Because the obvious next question is, what does that mean for generative AI systems trained on copyrighted material and capable of producing outputs that may infringe? Legal experts quoted in the reporting say the same framework likely applies. If the system was not designed or marketed specifically to generate infringing material, then the fact that users can do infringing things with it does not automatically create contributory liability for the model provider.
That's the key distinction. Not can the model produce infringing output, but was the model intentionally built or promoted for that use? And that is a much better legal position for AI firms than a regime where broad capability itself triggers liability.
Put differently, the court has reinforced a doctrine that protects dual-use systems. If a technology has substantial lawful uses, the fact that some users employ it unlawfully is not enough on its own to sink the provider. That's Sony logic, now reinforced in a context AI companies care deeply about.
And AI companies need that protection because their products are fundamentally dual-use. A text model can draft a business memo, summarize a contract, explain a scientific paper, or produce language that resembles copyrighted material. An image model can generate original artwork or something uncomfortably derivative. If every infringing edge case exposed the provider to sweeping secondary liability, the business model gets far shakier very quickly.
This doesn't end the copyright fights. Far from it. Training data lawsuits still matter. Output similarity disputes still matter. Product design choices still matter. If a company makes it easy to imitate living artists, or markets a model explicitly around replacing copyrighted works with close substitutes, it can still create a terrible factual record for itself.
Right. The shield is not immunity. It's a legal framework that says courts will look for intent, inducement, and design posture, not just raw capability. And that matters because it gives AI firms room to keep building while the cases work through the system.
I think the broader consequence is strategic. If you're OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Meta, or any other large model developer, this ruling reduces one category of existential uncertainty. You still have litigation risk. You still have regulatory risk. But the nightmare scenario where a court says, essentially, your general-purpose system can be used to infringe, therefore you're broadly contributorily liable, looks less likely today than it did before.
And that changes boardroom decisions. Legal ambiguity slows deployment. A clearer shield accelerates it. So this is one of those legal stories that won't feel dramatic to most people in the moment, but it may quietly shape the pace of AI product rollouts for the next year.
The human layer shows up here too. Engineers and researchers build the systems, but courts decide the liability envelope those systems live inside. And when the envelope gets wider, the industry moves faster.
There's also a consumer platform dimension here that shouldn't be missed. The biggest AI companies are building systems that can summarize, imitate, draft, and generate at enormous scale. The next legal question was always going to be whether society treats that capability like a copier, a VCR, a search engine, or something categorically new. Courts leaning toward the dual-use framework are effectively saying, for now, we are not going to invent a radically harsher doctrine just because the outputs feel uncanny.
And that buys time. Time for product iteration. Time for settlements. Time for licensing deals. Time for business models that depend on broad model access to mature before the law fully catches up. In fast-moving industries, time is often the most valuable legal asset you can get.
Gallup released a poll of 1,500 Americans aged 14 to 29, and the headline is easy to say but harder to interpret: Gen Z AI usage has plateaued. No meaningful growth since the same survey last year.
If that were the only finding, it would already be notable. The AI industry is still priced, marketed, and narrated as if demand curves only go one direction, up. More tools, more access, more habit formation, more dependency. A plateau in the youngest major cohort should make people pause.
But the more important signal is emotional. Curiosity still leads as the dominant feeling toward AI, but anxiety and anger are rising quickly, and excitement and hope are down year over year. That is a very different emotional profile from the one the industry has been counting on.
I think people have underestimated how much the long-term AI adoption story depends on effect, not just utility. The standard argument is simple: younger people grow up with new tools, so they normalize them faster. But normalization doesn't happen automatically. It depends on whether the tools feel empowering, trustworthy, fair, and worth incorporating into your identity and your work.
And Gen Z may be seeing too many reasons for caution at once. They are watching schools struggle to decide whether AI use is cheating or literacy. They are hearing employers say AI skills are mandatory while also hearing that AI may reduce entry-level opportunities. They are using tools that are impressive but inconsistent. And they are absorbing a constant stream of cultural messaging that swings between utopian hype and job loss panic.
So the emotional picture makes sense. Curiosity remains because the tools are genuinely interesting. Anxiety rises because the implications are increasingly personal. Anger rises because a lot of the adoption is happening to people rather than for them.
Gallup called this a growing credibility challenge that access alone will not solve. I think that's exactly right. The industry has largely treated adoption friction as a distribution problem. Get the tools in more hands. Lower cost. Increase integration. Put AI in every app people already use. But if the emotional substrate is getting worse, then more access won't necessarily create more trust or more enthusiasm.
And remember who we're talking about. This is the cohort that will define workplace norms over the next decade. Gen Z has already overtaken boomers in the US labor force. If the generation expected to mainstream AI at work is emotionally ambivalent instead of excited, that changes the slope of adoption inside institutions.
There's also a reputational asymmetry at play. Every new useful feature helps a little. Every high-profile failure, hallucination, surveillance concern, or job displacement story hits much harder. So even if tools keep improving, the net emotional balance can still move negative.
Which means the challenge for AI companies is no longer just proving capability. They have to prove social legitimacy. They have to show that using these systems doesn't quietly make life worse, employment shakier, education less fair, or culture more synthetic than people want. I also think there's a class dimension hidden in this data. The people most enthusiastic about AI in public discourse are often the people already positioned to benefit from it: founders, managers, investors, technically competent knowledge workers. Gen Z contains a lot of people who do not experience AI first as leverage. They experience it as surveillance in school, automation pressure at work, or another demand to adapt faster than institutions are willing to support.
That's a crucial point. If your first encounters with AI are plagiarism detectors, interview filters, summary bots in customer service, and executives talking about headcount efficiency, then the emotional baseline is not wonder. It's suspicion. Curiosity survives because the tools are powerful. But trust doesn't emerge automatically from power.
And trust is what turns occasional use into habitual use. It is what makes a generation decide this belongs in my workflow, my education, my creativity, my daily problem solving. Plateauing usage alongside worsening sentiment suggests people may be trying the tools without integrating them into identity or routine.
And if they can't do that, then the plateau Gallup captured may not be a temporary pause. It may be the beginning of a more durable ceiling.
State legislatures continue to do what Congress has mostly failed to do, which is write actual AI policy in real time. Tennessee's SB 837 passed the Senate 26-6, and the House approved the companion bill 93-2. The core move is simple and explicit: define human being, life, and natural person in state law in a way that excludes AI, algorithms, software, and machines.
That may sound obvious, almost redundant, but legislatures usually don't bother writing the obvious into statute unless they think ambiguity could matter later. Tennessee is preemptively closing the door on any attempt to map human legal categories onto artificial systems.
The symbolic part is obvious. The practical part is more interesting. Legal systems are full of inherited language written long before anyone imagined autonomous software systems participating in decision-making, communication, commerce, or representation at scale. Once AI starts acting in spaces previously occupied by humans, legislators start asking whether old definitions still hold under stress.
Tennessee's answer is, don't wait for that stress test. Write the boundary now. AI is not a person, not life, not a rights-bearing natural entity under these categories. That matters because once a definition hardens in law, a lot of downstream interpretation hardens with it.
And Tennessee is not moving in isolation. Maine has already banned clinical AI in mental health therapy, allowing administrative support but not clinical use. Missouri is advancing a therapy chatbot ban with $10,000 per violation penalties enforced by the Attorney General. The pattern across states is becoming visible.
Especially in sensitive domains like mental health, medicine, and legal decision-making, states are drawing boundaries before there is a settled federal framework. They are not waiting for national consensus. They are writing local rules that reflect precaution, politics, and public anxiety.
I think we should take seriously how much of the first meaningful AI governance in the United States may end up being state-level patchwork. Not elegant, not uniform, not especially coherent across jurisdictions, but real. And once enough states move, companies don't get to treat those laws as edge cases. They become operating constraints.
There's another layer too. Tennessee's bill is partly about rights, but it's also about cultural signaling. It tells courts, agencies, and the public that the legislature sees personhood language as a protected human category at a moment when AI discourse routinely anthropomorphizes systems. In that sense, the law is pushing back not only on hypothetical lawsuits but on the rhetoric of the industry itself.
That's important because anthropomorphism is one of the industry's favorite shortcuts. Systems are framed as collaborators, companions, agents, even co-workers. Legislatures are increasingly responding by saying, fine, use whatever marketing language you want, but in law we are going to be precise.
And precision matters most when systems get close to vulnerability. A therapy chatbot is not just another app. A system speaking in the register of care, diagnosis, or counsel can influence people in moments where they are psychologically fragile. That's why these state moves around therapy AI feel so consequential. The states are saying there are categories of human interaction where simulation alone is not enough. What we're watching is policy preemption by accumulated discomfort. Legislators may not agree on comprehensive AI governance, but they can still identify narrow zones where the public would be deeply uneasy if machines were allowed to occupy human roles without constraint. Therapy is one of those zones. Personhood language is another. Those are areas where symbolic clarity has real political value.
And companies should pay attention to that. The industry often assumes regulation will focus first on frontier training, compute thresholds, or national security controls. But a lot of the politically durable regulation may arrive through simpler questions. Can this system counsel a vulnerable person? Can it impersonate a trusted role? Can it claim protections intended for humans? Can it operate where consent and dependency are complicated? Those questions are easier for states to legislate and easier for voters to understand. Which brings us back to the episode title. The human layer is where these boundaries get enforced. Not at the GPU level, not in the benchmark, but in law and public norms.
Story 5 is infrastructure, but with a twist. Intel and Google announced a multi-year collaboration that reinforces a point the market has been trying very hard to forget. AI does not run on GPUs alone.
The announcement centers on Intel Xeon continuing to power large portions of Google Cloud infrastructure, plus co-development of custom ASIC-based infrastructure processing units, IPUs, that offload networking, storage, and security tasks from host CPUs.
That sounds abstract until you remember how modern AI systems actually operate. A training cluster is not just matrix multiplication. An inference stack is not just a model answering prompts. There is orchestration, networking, storage access, data preparation, scheduling, security isolation, memory movement, and workload coordination. Those are system problems, and system problems are often CPU problems.
The popular capital markets narrative has collapsed the AI stack into a single symbol, GPU. If it's not an accelerator, it gets treated like a commodity supporting actor. Intel and Google are making the counterargument that heterogeneous compute is the real story. GPUs matter enormously. So do CPUs. So do networking and storage offload layers. So do custom chips purpose-built for infrastructure handling.
And from Intel's perspective, this is the argument it has to win. It probably can't out-hype NVIDIA on accelerator mystique. But it can remind hyperscalers and investors that data center economics are about total systems, not just the hottest component in the rack.
There's also a utilization story here. If you can offload networking, storage, and security work away from the host CPU to specialized infrastructure units, you free more of the system to do the work it's best at. That improves predictability and efficiency at scale. For cloud operators, those gains compound quickly.
I think the deeper significance is narrative correction. For the last year, the AI conversation has implied a near monoculture of value. GPUs win, everything else orbits them. But real deployments don't look like that. They look like layers. Data comes in somewhere. It gets moved, pre-processed, secured, scheduled, served, and monitored. The glamorous chip does not replace the rest of the machine.
And if the market starts remembering that, companies like Intel get a more plausible place in the AI build-out story. Not as the center of frontier model glamour, but as part of the operating substrate without which the glamour doesn't turn into a usable service. This is also why the AI supply chain conversation keeps widening. Every time attention narrows to one chip category, reality reasserts itself. Models need data pipelines. Data pipelines need servers. Servers need orchestration. Clouds need isolation and routing. Enterprise buyers need predictable performance, not just theoretical peak throughput. CPUs remain the general-purpose glue that keeps specialized hardware from becoming an expensive pile of disconnected potential.
And the hyperscaler perspective is always more systems-oriented than the public conversation. Google does not care only about the most glamorous component. It cares about total cost of ownership, utilization, service reliability, deployment flexibility, and how efficiently workloads move through the whole estate. That's why collaborations like this matter, even if they don't dominate headlines the way a new accelerator launch does.
Our final story is the one that ties most directly to everyday business reality. Morningstar published an analysis of the AI productivity paradox. Firms broadly agree AI should eventually raise productivity and margins, but many are seeing the opposite right now.
The phrase that matters here is hybrid adoption. Most companies are not replacing old processes with AI-native workflows. They are layering AI on top of existing processes. And that often creates duplication, not efficiency.
Exactly. You still have the legacy review process, but now you also have prompt design, output checking, model validation, workflow mapping, documentation updates, and compliance review around the AI layer. The work doesn't disappear. It gets split, mirrored, and sometimes expanded.
And because AI outputs remain probabilistic, organizations add supervision rather than subtract it. A human still checks the work, often more carefully than before because the error profile is unfamiliar. So for a while, you end up paying for both the old method and the new one at once.
That's why the historical comparisons matter. Electricity, computers, and the internet all had phases where productivity gains lagged deployment. The technology was real, but the organizational redesign required to benefit from it took longer than the hardware rollout or the software purchase order.
McKinsey's projections of double-digit margin improvement may still be right in the long run. But firms live in the short run. If the next 6 to 18 months are consumed by retraining staff, redesigning workflows, cleaning up data, validating outputs, and reassigning accountability, then the CFO experiences AI not as immediate leverage but as an expensive transition.
I think this is where a lot of public AI discourse goes wrong. It treats technological capability as if it automatically translates into organizational performance. But companies are social systems. Workflows are political. Incentives are messy. Managers don't just install transformation like a software patch.
And that means the friction isn't a bug in the adoption story. It is the adoption story. The dip is what happens when a powerful but imperfect new layer lands inside institutions built for older methods.
The uncomfortable implication for vendors is that the marketing is directionally true but temporally misleading. This will make you more productive, maybe accurate at equilibrium. But before equilibrium comes rework, confusion, process debt, and competing definitions of what counts as done.
That's why Meta's story at the top of the episode matters so much. One response to the productivity paradox is to keep AI at the tool layer and wait for gains to show up. Another is to redesign the organization around AI more aggressively, even painfully, in hopes of reaching the gain phase faster. Meta is choosing the second path. The painful part for managers is that hybrid adoption often looks successful from a distance. A team reports faster first drafts. Another team cuts turnaround time on some tasks. Executives see demos that are visibly better than last quarter's demos. But when you zoom out to the organization level, those local wins are offset by review overhead, exception handling, governance meetings, training sessions, and the simple fact that nobody fully trusts the new process yet.
That's why so many AI rollouts feel both impressive and disappointing. The tool is impressive. The organizational effect is disappointing. People confuse the first for the second because the first is visible in a product demo while the second only shows up in quarterly operating results and employee frustration.
And eventually the firms that benefit will be the ones willing to do the harder thing, retire old processes, rewrite responsibilities, and decide where human judgment still adds value instead of just stapling AI to the side of everything. But that kind of redesign is disruptive, political, and uncomfortable. Which is exactly why so many companies delay it.
So the paradox isn't that AI fails to work. It's that institutions are trying to capture the upside of a new operating model without fully paying the transitional cost of becoming a new operating model. For a while, you get both the cost and the uncertainty at the same time. Which means a lot of the headlines we covered today are actually one story viewed from different angles. Firms are reorganizing labor. Courts are widening legal room to build. Young users are deciding whether they trust the shift. Legislatures are drawing moral and legal boundaries. Infrastructure vendors are arguing over what the stack really is. And executives are discovering that deploy AI and become more productive are not the same sentence.
Before we close, I want to add one builder's take because today's stories point in the same operational direction. The companies that do best in the next phase of AI adoption will not be the ones with the loudest AI branding. They'll be the ones that can answer three plain questions clearly: what work is this system actually replacing, who remains accountable when it is wrong, and what human role becomes more valuable rather than less once the system is in place.
That's the maturity test. Not did you add AI to the workflow, but did you redesign the workflow honestly? If the answer is no, then you probably haven't transformed anything. You've added a probabilistic layer on top of a legacy process and renamed the tension innovation.
And honest redesign requires a level of specificity many organizations still avoid. If an AI system drafts reports, who owns the final truth claim? If an agent files tickets, who audits the escalation logic? If a model helps with therapy intake, where is the boundary beyond which a human must take over immediately? If engineering agents write code, what is the promotion path for the people now supervising instead of implementing? These are not edge questions. They are the core design questions.
The reason they matter is that trust compounds in one direction and institutional memory compounds in the other. If you deploy systems without clear boundaries, people learn caution, resentment, and workaround behavior. If you deploy them with explicit roles, auditability, and believable accountability, people learn where the tool helps and where it doesn't. That difference determines whether the human layer stabilizes or revolts.
So when we look back on this period, I don't think the biggest dividing line will be who adopted AI first. I think it will be who understood early that AI deployment was really organizational design under pressure, labor design, legal design, workflow design, trust design. The model matters. The human layer decides whether the model sticks.
And that's why this week's headlines feel so connected. They aren't random AI stories. They're signs that the argument has moved from capability to structure. Who gets moved? Who gets protected? Who gets persuaded? Who gets regulated? Who gets paid? And who gets left holding responsibility when the machine is wrong?
That's the episode. Meta's mandatory AI engineering transfers. The Supreme Court's contributory liability signal for AI. Gen Z's adoption plateau and emotional shift. Tennessee defining AI out of personhood language while states tighten therapy boundaries. Intel and Google making the systems case for CPUs. And the productivity paradox that explains why AI can feel simultaneously inevitable and inefficient.
Full show notes and source links are at tobeyonfitnesstech.com, along with the episode archive and transcripts. If you want the articles behind today's stories, that's where to find them.
We'll be back soon.
See you then.